The morning sun cast long shadows across the NATO training facility in Norfolk, Virginia. The air was thick with tension and the sound of boots marching in perfect formation. Commander Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the field, his weathered face scanning the horizon as he watched his elite SEAL team run through their morning drills. At 38, Jake had seen more combat than most men twice his age, and his reputation preceded him wherever he went in military circles. The facility buzzed with activity as soldiers from various NATO countries prepared for the joint training exercise that would begin in 3 days. This was no ordinary drill. It was a high-stakes simulation designed to test the limits of international cooperation in combat scenarios. Representatives from 12 different countries had gathered, each bringing their best and brightest to prove their worth on the global stage. Jake's second-in-command, Lieutenant Ryan Shun, jogged up to him with a tablet in hand. "Sir, we've got the final roster for the international participants. Most of them arrived yesterday, but there's one more coming in today." He paused, scrolling through the digital files. "Actually, sir, there's something strange about this last edition. The file is mostly classified, even to us. All we know is that they're being sent by a classified NATO division." The commander frowned, taking the tablet and examining the sparse information. The entry showed only a serial number, a classification level that even surprised him, and an estimated arrival time of 1,400 hours. No name, no photograph, no country of origin. In his 15 years of commanding SEAL operations, Jake had never encountered such secrecy surrounding a training participant. "Any idea what division they're from?" Jake asked, handing the tablet back to Chun. "That's the thing, sir. The division code doesn't match any of our standard NATO classifications. Intelligence thinks it might be from one of the new Joint Special Operations units, but nobody's talking." As the day progressed, speculation ran wild among the troops. The mystery participant had become the subject of countless theories and whispered conversations in the mess hall. Some believed it was a test, a high-ranking officer sent to evaluate their performance. Others thought it might be a foreign dignitary's child being given special treatment. The more paranoid soldiers whispered about spies and double agents. Jake tried to maintain his focus on the training preparations, but the unknown variable nagged at him. He had built his career on being prepared for every possibility, on knowing his team and his mission inside and out. This blank space in his intelligence felt like a vulnerability he couldn't afford. At precisely 1,400 hours, a black military transport vehicle pulled through the main gates. Jake watched from his office window as it made its way across the compound, noting the absence of any identifying marks or flags. The vehicle stopped near the administration building, and for several minutes, nothing happened. No one emerged, no doors opened. It was as if the occupants were waiting for something. Finally, the rear door opened and a figure stepped out. Even from his second-story vantage point, Jake could see that the person was smaller in stature than he had expected. The individual wore standard military fatigues, but there was something different about their bearing. They moved with a fluid confidence that spoke of extensive training, yet there was an almost ghost-like quality to their presence. Jake grabbed his cap and headed downstairs. As the commanding officer, it was his responsibility to greet all participants personally, regardless of how mysterious their background might be. He made his way across the courtyard, his boots clicking against the concrete as he approached the transport vehicle. The figure had their back turned, speaking quietly with what appeared to be an aide or escort. Jay couldn't make out the words, but the tone was crisp and professional. As he drew closer, he realized that the mysterious participant was a woman, something that hadn't been indicated in the sparse file he'd reviewed. "Excuse me," Jake called out, his voice carrying the authority of command. "I'm Commander Morrison, and I'll be overseeing your participation in this training exercise." The woman turned around, and Jake found himself looking into the most piercing green eyes he had ever encountered. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Her face was composed, almost serene, but there was an intensity in her gaze that made Jake feel as though she was evaluating him just as thoroughly as he was studying her. "Commander," she said simply, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, and Jake noticed calluses that spoke of extensive weapons training. "I appreciate your hospitality. I'm afraid I didn't catch your name," Jake said, waiting for her to fill in the obvious gap in his knowledge. "That's because it wasn't given," she replied with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "For the purposes of this exercise, You can refer to me as Agent 7. Jake felt his jaw tighten slightly. In all his years of military service, he had learned to read people quickly and accurately. This woman was clearly military, but there was something else about her, an air of authority that seemed to transcend normal rank structures. She carried herself like someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Agent 7, Jake repeated, tasting the words. And what unit are you representing? I'm here as an observer and participant in the joint exercises, she said, deflecting his question with practiced ease. My superiors believe that these training scenarios will provide valuable insights into current NATO operational capabilities. Before Jake could press for more details, Lieutenant Shun appeared at his side. Sir, we need to get the final briefings completed before tomorrow's opening ceremonies. He glanced at the woman with barely concealed curiosity. Of course, Jake said. Agent 7, I'll have Lieutenant Shun show you to your quarters and provide you with the exercise protocols. We'll conduct a full briefing at 0800 tomorrow morning. As Chun led the mysterious woman away, Jake watched her go with growing unease. Everything about her seemed calculated, from her carefully neutral responses to the way she moved through the compound, as though she was already familiar with its layout. He made a mental note to contact his intelligence contacts after dinner to see if anyone could shed light on who exactly he was dealing with. The evening mess hall was unusually animated as word of the mysterious new arrival spread throughout the compound. Jake sat with his senior staff, half listening to their speculations while keeping one eye on Agent 7, who had chosen a table in the corner where she could observe the entire room while keeping her back to the wall. I'm telling you, she's got to be CIA, whispered Master Sergeant Rodriguez, Jake's weapons specialist. Did you see the way she scanned the room when she walked in? That's tradecraft, not standard military training. My money's on foreign intelligence, countered Lieutenant Phillips, the team's communications expert. Maybe she's here to evaluate our security protocols. You know how paranoid the brass has been about information leaks lately. Jake found himself studying Agent 7 more closely as she ate her meal in solitude. She seemed completely comfortable being the center of speculation, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it. Occasionally, she would look up from her food to survey the room, and Jake noticed that her gaze lingered on specific individuals, always the senior officers and team leaders. After dinner, Jake decided to make another attempt at gathering information. He approached her table just as she was finishing her meal. Mind if I join you for a moment? He asked. Please, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Jake sat down, leaning back in his chair with what he hoped appeared to be casual interest. I have to admit, Agent 7, your arrival has certainly created quite a stir among my people. It's not often we have participants with such selective file sharing. She smiled, and this time it seemed more genuine. I imagine it must be frustrating for someone in your position. You strike me as the type of leader who likes to know everything about his operational environment. Guilty as charged, Jake admitted. In my line of work, unknowns tend to get people killed. In mine too, she said quietly, and Jake caught something in her tone that made him look at her more sharply. And what line of work is that exactly? Agent 7 studied him for a long moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Let's just say that I specialize in situations where conventional military approaches aren't sufficient. The cryptic response only deepened Jake's curiosity, but before he could formulate another question, she stood up. I should get some rest. Tomorrow promises to be an interesting day. As she walked away, Jake found himself more intrigued than ever. There was something about Agent 7 that didn't fit the normal patterns he had learned to recognize in his years of service. She wasn't just mysterious. She was professionally mysterious, as if maintaining secrets was as natural to her as breathing. That night, Jake lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through possibilities. He had served alongside special operations personnel from dozens of different units and countries, but none of them had ever made him feel quite so off balance. Agent 7 seemed to exist in a space between the structured world of military hierarchy and something else entirely, something that operated by different rules. His phone buzzed with an incoming message, and Jake glanced at the screen to see a text from his intelligence contact at the Pentagon. The message was brief and not particularly helpful. No records found matching your query. Suggest proceeding with standard protocols. Jake set the phone aside with a frustrated sigh. In the morning, the joint training exercises would begin in earnest, and he would finally get a chance to see Agent 7 in action. Perhaps then he would begin to understand who she really was and why her presence at the facility felt like the calm before a storm. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Jake's last conscious thought was a nagging feeling that the next few days would challenge everything he thought he knew about military operations and the people who conducted them. Agent 7 was clearly more than she appeared to be, and Jake had a growing suspicion that her true purpose at the NATO facility had very little to do with standard training exercises. The compound settled into the quiet rhythms of night, but in a small room in the visiting officer's quarters, Agent 7 sat at a small desk, typing rapidly on an encrypted laptop. Her report was brief and coded, but the essence was clear. She had arrived safely, made initial contact with the target, and was proceeding with her mission as planned. As she closed the laptop and prepared for bed, she allowed herself a small smile. Commander Morrison was exactly as her briefings had described him: competent, thorough, and protective of his people. What her superiors hadn't mentioned was how those qualities would make him an interesting challenge. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The first rays of dawn broke over the NATO training facility, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Commander Jake Morrison was already dressed and reviewing the day's exercise protocols when reveille sounded across the compound. Today marked the official beginning of the joint training exercises, and Jake wanted everything to run with military precision. At 0800 hours sharp, representatives from all participating units gathered in the main briefing hall. Jake stood at the podium, looking out over a sea of faces representing some of the most elite military units in the world. British SAS, German KSK, French GGN, Canadian JDF-2, and several other special operations teams had sent their best personnel for this unprecedented training collaboration. Agent 7 sat in the third row, her posture relaxed but alert. Jake noticed that she had positioned herself where she could observe both the briefing materials and the reactions of the other participants. Even in a room full of highly trained special operations personnel, there was something about her that set her apart. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Over the next 5 days, you will participate in a series of exercises designed to test your ability to operate effectively in joint international operations. These scenarios have been developed based on real-world threats and will push you to your limits both individually and as integrated teams." He clicked a remote, and the large screen behind him displayed a detailed map of the training area. "Your first exercise begins in 30 minutes. You will be divided into mixed teams of 6, with representatives from at least 3 different countries per team. The scenario involves a hostage rescue operation in an urban environment with multiple complications and time constraints." As Jake continued his briefing, he found his eyes repeatedly drifting to Agent 7. Unlike the other participants who were taking notes and asking clarifying questions, she seemed to be absorbing every word without effort. There was an intensity in her focus that reminded him of a predator studying its prey. "Team assignments are posted on the board outside," Jake concluded. "You have 20 minutes to review the scenario details and select your equipment. Good luck." As the participants filed out of the hall, Jake checked the team roster he had personally arranged. He had deliberately placed Agent 7 on a team with some of his most experienced SEAL operators, hoping that the familiar dynamics would help him better understand her capabilities. The first exercise took place in a mock urban environment that had been constructed specifically for close-quarters combat training. The scenario involved a terrorist group holding civilians in a multi-story building, with each team required to coordinate their approach and execute a successful rescue within a 40-minute time limit. Jake positioned himself in the observation tower, where he could monitor all team communications and watch the exercise unfold through a network of cameras placed throughout the training area. He was particularly interested in observing how Agent 7 would function as part of a team, especially one led by Lieutenant Sarah Collins, one of his most capable officers. "Control, this is Team 3, Collins' voice crackled through the radio. "We're in position at the south entrance. Beginning our approach now." Through the camera feeds, Jake watched as the 6-person team moved through the simulated building with practiced efficiency. Collins took point, with Agent 7 positioned second in the formation. What immediately caught Jake's attention was how seamlessly Agent 7 integrated with the team's movements, as if she had been training with them for years rather than meeting them for the first time an hour earlier. "Contact, second floor, east corridor," reported Sergeant Thompson, the team sniper. Two tangos, armed with assault rifles. Jake watched as Agent 7 made a series of hand signals that caused the entire team to adjust their approach without missing a beat. Her signals were not standard NATO protocol, yet somehow every team member understood her meaning immediately. How did she know about the third shooter? Jake muttered to himself as he watched Agent 7 guide Collins away from what appeared to be an empty doorway just seconds before a simulated enemy emerged from that exact location. The exercise continued for another 20 minutes, with Team 3 executing what Jake had to admit was one of the most flawless hostage rescue operations he had ever observed. Agent 7's contributions were subtle, but consistently crucial. A redirected teammate here, an alternative route suggestion there, all delivered with the kind of tactical awareness that typically took years to develop. When the exercise concluded, Jake made his way down to the debriefing area where the teams were gathering to review their performance. He arrived just in time to hear Lieutenant Collins addressing her team. "Outstanding work, everyone," Collins was saying. "Our execution time was 12 minutes under the target, with 0 civilian casualties and complete neutralization of all threats." She turned to Agent 7. "I have to say, your situational awareness in there was exceptional. How did you know about that sniper position on the 3rd floor?" Agent 7 shrugged modestly. "Experience. Similar building layouts tend to have predictable sightlines." Jake frowned. The building layout for this exercise had been designed specifically for this training event, using architectural principles that were not widely known outside of specialized security consulting circles. For Agent 7 to predict sniper positions with such accuracy suggested either remarkable tactical intuition or prior knowledge of the facility design. As the teams dispersed for lunch, Jake approached Agent 7. "Impressive performance in there," he said. "Lieutenant Collins is one of my best officers, and she seemed genuinely impressed by your tactical suggestions." "She's a good leader," Agent 7 replied. "Easy to work with when you're part of a competent team." "Your hand signals were interesting," Jake continued, probing gently. "Not standard NATO protocol, but the team responded perfectly. Where did you learn those?" For just a moment, Jake thought he saw something flicker in Agent 7's eyes. A brief hesitation that suggested he had touched on something significant. But her expression remained neutral. "Cross-training," she said simply. "Different units develop different communication methods. You learn to adapt." Jake nodded, but he wasn't satisfied with the answer. He had observed special operations teams from around the world, and Agent 7's signals had been unlike anything in his experience. They were too precise, too specialized to be the result of simple cross-training. The afternoon brought a more complex exercise, a multi-phase operation that required teams to infiltrate a defended compound, extract intelligence, and then evade pursuit through hostile territory. This time, Jake decided to observe from the field, positioning himself at various checkpoints throughout the course. Agent 7's team was assigned to the 3rd wave of the exercise, giving Jake time to watch the first 2 teams struggle with the challenges. Both teams managed to complete their primary objectives, but took significant casualties during the extraction phase due to the aggressive pursuit scenario. When Team 3 began their approach, Jake positioned himself at a concealed observation point near the main compound. Through his binoculars, he watched as the team moved through the outer perimeter with exceptional coordination. Agent 7 was no longer following Lieutenant Collins' lead. She had somehow become the tactical decision-maker for the group, though she maintained the appearance of supporting Collins' commands. What truly caught Jake's attention was a moment when Agent 7 suddenly signaled for the entire team to take cover behind a concrete barrier. Collins looked confused. The area appeared clear of all threats. But Agent 7 insisted, and 15 seconds later, a patrol that wasn't supposed to be in that sector, according to the exercise plan, walked directly through the space where the team would have been. Jake immediately contacted the exercise controllers. "Control, this is Morrison. Why is there an unscheduled patrol in Sector 7? "Sir, there isn't," came the reply. "All patrol routes are proceeding according to the exercise timeline." Jake looked through his binoculars again, but the patrol had vanished, and Team 3 was continuing their approach. He began to wonder if he had imagined the entire incident, but Agent 7's reaction had been too specific, too confident to be based on a false alarm. The team completed their infiltration flawlessly, extracted the required intelligence, and began their exfiltration route. Jake moved to an observation point that would allow him to watch the pursuit phase, typically the most challenging part of the exercise. As the simulated enemy forces began their chase, Jake was amazed to see Agent 7 leading her team through a series of evasion techniques that seemed almost supernatural in their effectiveness. She anticipated every move by the pursuing forces, choosing routes and hiding spots that kept them one step ahead throughout the entire 40-minute chase scenario. When the exercise concluded, Jake was waiting at the extraction point. Team 3 emerged from the forest looking barely winded, while the pursuing forces were still searching for them 2 kilometers away. "Ow!" Jake asked Collins directly as the team approached. "Honestly, sir, I'm not sure," Collins replied, glancing at Agent 7. It was like she could predict exactly what the pursuit teams were going to do. Every time they tried to flank us or set up an ambush, she had us moving in a different direction before they could get in position. Jake turned to Agent 7, but before he could ask his question, she spoke first. "Permission to make a suggestion, Commander? Go ahead. Your pursuit teams are using standard military tactics," she said. "Predictable patterns based on conventional training. In real-world scenarios, you might want to incorporate more irregular warfare techniques. And you're familiar with these techniques?" Agent 7 met his gaze steadily. "I've had occasion to study them." That evening, Jake found himself in the unusual position of being completely stumped by a subordinate's background. Agent 7's performance had been nothing short of remarkable, but it raised more questions than it answered. Her tactical knowledge extended far beyond what any single military unit could provide, and her ability to predict enemy movements suggested either extensive experience or access to intelligence that exceeded anything available to the other participants. He decided to try a different approach. Instead of asking direct questions that Agent 7 seemed adept at deflecting, he would create scenarios that might reveal more about her true capabilities and background. After dinner, Jake approached Agent 7 in the recreation area, where she was reading what appeared to be a technical manual. "Agent 7, I wonder if I could ask you to participate in a special briefing tomorrow morning. We're considering modifications to our standard training protocols based on some of the techniques we've observed during today's exercises." She looked up from her reading, and Jake noticed the manual was written in what appeared to be Russian. When she saw him looking at it, she closed it casually. "Of course, Commander. What time?" 0700 hours. Conference Room B. I'll be there." As Jake walked away, he made a mental note to have his intelligence contacts run every possible background check on mysterious NATO participants with advanced tactical knowledge and apparent familiarity with Russian technical literature. Something told him that Agent 7's true story was far more complex than anyone at the facility suspected. That night, Jake lay awake thinking about the day's events. Agent 7's performance had been flawless, but flawless in a way that suggested capabilities far beyond what any normal participant should possess. Her tactical knowledge, her ability to read enemy movements, her familiarity with advanced communication protocols, all of it pointed to someone with extensive special operations experience at the highest levels. But what troubled Jake most was the growing feeling that Agent 7's presence at the training facility wasn't coincidental. Everything about her suggested someone on a mission, and Jake was beginning to suspect that the mission had very little to do with training exercises. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Jake's last thought was a determination to uncover Agent 7's true identity and purpose, no matter what it took. Tomorrow, he would begin pushing harder for answers, and if Agent 7 was hiding something significant, he intended to find out what it was. Jake arrived at conference room B 15 minutes early, wanting to set up the morning briefing exactly as he had planned it. This wasn't going to be a standard training review. He had designed what he privately called a stress interview disguised as a tactical consultation. If Agent 7 was hiding something significant, he intended to uncover it through careful questioning and observation. At exactly 0700 hours, Agent 7 knocked on the door and entered. She wore standard military fatigues, but Jake noticed that her equipment belt carried items he didn't recognize, tools that looked more specialized than anything typically issued to training participants. "Good morning, Commander," she said, taking the seat he indicated across from the conference table. "You mentioned wanting to discuss training protocol modifications?" "That's right," Jake replied, settling into his chair and opening a folder filled with exercise reports. "Your team's performance yesterday was remarkable, particularly your tactical awareness during the evasion phase." Agent 7 nodded politely, but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. Jake pulled out a detailed map of the training area and spread it across the table. "I'm curious about this route you selected here," he said, pointing to a section of the forest where Team 3 had successfully evaded their pursuers. "Our analysis shows that you led your team through terrain that isn't covered in any of the briefing materials we provided. How did you know about this particular path?" For the first time since he had met her, Jake saw Agent 7 hesitate. It was only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to confirm his suspicions that there was more to her story than she had revealed. "Reconnaissance," she said finally. "I made it a point to familiarize myself with the training area before the exercises began." "When?" Jake asked immediately. "You arrived yesterday afternoon, and you've been accounted for since then. When did you have time to conduct reconnaissance of a 20-square-kilometer area?" Agent 7 leaned back in her chair, and Jake could see her calculating her response. "I had access to detailed satellite imagery before my arrival," she said. "It's standard procedure for my unit to study operational areas in advance." Jake made a note on his pad, though what he wrote had nothing to do with training protocols. Agent 7's explanation was plausible, but raised even more questions about what kind of unit she represented and what level of intelligence resources they had access to. "Satellite imagery doesn't typically show footpaths through dense forest," Jake observed. "The route your team used yesterday required intimate knowledge of ground-level terrain features." "Commander," Agent 7 said, and there was a slight edge to her voice that hadn't been there before, "I'm beginning to feel like this is more of an interrogation than a briefing about training modifications." Jake set down his pen and looked directly at her. "You're right. It is." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Agent 7, in my 15 years of commanding special operations, I've never encountered anyone with your combination of capabilities. Your tactical knowledge exceeds that of most senior officers. Your situational awareness is almost supernatural, and you seem to have access to intelligence resources that go beyond anything I've seen in joint NATO operations." Agent 7 remained silent, her green eyes studying Jake's face with an intensity that made him feel as though she was evaluating him for something more than just his command capabilities. "So here's my question," Jake continued. "Are you here to participate in training exercises, or are you here to evaluate something else entirely? Because if it's the latter, I need to know what you're really looking for." For a long moment, the room was completely silent except for the distant sound of morning PT activities outside. Agent 7 seemed to be weighing her options, considering how much truth she could afford to reveal. "Commander Morrison," she said finally, "what do you know about asymmetric warfare threats to NATO installations?" The question caught Jake off guard. It wasn't at all what he had expected her to say, and the sudden shift in topic suggested that he had finally touched on something significant. "I know that it's a growing concern," he replied carefully. "Why?" "Because that's why I'm really here," Agent 7 said. "Not to participate in training exercises, but to evaluate this facility's vulnerability to unconventional attack methods." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying there's a specific threat?" "I'm saying there are always threats," Agent 7 replied. "And most military installations are woefully unprepared for them because they're designed to defend against conventional military attacks, not against adversaries who don't follow conventional rules." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the training areas where dozens of elite soldiers were conducting their morning exercises. "Tell me, Commander, how would your facility defend against an attack by someone who looks and acts exactly like one of your authorized personnel?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Jake suddenly understood why Agent 7's presence had felt so unsettling. She wasn't just demonstrating exceptional tactical capabilities. She was demonstrating how easily someone with those capabilities could infiltrate and operate within a secure military facility. "Your intelligence," Jake said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "You're here to test our security protocols by seeing how far you can get operating under false pretenses." Agent 7 turned back toward him, and for the first time since he had met her, she smiled genuinely. "Very good, Commander, though it's a bit more complex than that." "How complex?" "Complex enough that I need you to understand something very important," Agent 7 said, returning to her seat. "What I've shown you over the past 2 days, the tactical knowledge, the situational awareness, the ability to predict and counter enemy movements, none of that is theoretical. It's all based on real-world experience gained in situations that most people in the military will never encounter. Jake leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications. What kind of situations? The kind where the enemy doesn't wear uniforms, doesn't follow the Geneva Convention, and doesn't limit themselves to conventional weapons or tactics, Agent 7 replied. The kind where a single individual with the right training and resources can cause more damage than an entire conventional military unit. And you've encountered these situations personally? Agent 7 nodded. More times than I care to count, which is why I'm here to evaluate whether this facility and others like it are prepared for that type of threat. Jake stood up and began pacing around the small conference room. Okay, let's say I accept that you're some kind of intelligence operative conducting a security evaluation. That still doesn't explain your tactical capabilities. The way you performed in yesterday's exercises went far beyond what any single person should be able to accomplish. What if I told you, Agent 7 said slowly, that there are people in this world who have been trained specifically to operate at that level? People who have been given resources, training, and authority that go far beyond what normal military units possess. I'd say that sounds like something out of a spy novel. And you'd be right, Agent 7 replied. Except that spy novels are usually based on reality, just with the serial numbers filed off for public consumption. Jake stopped pacing and stared at her. Are you telling me that you're some kind of super soldier? Agent 7 laughed, and the sound was surprisingly warm and genuine. No, Commander. I'm telling you that I'm someone who has been trained to think and operate outside the normal boundaries of military doctrine. Someone who has been given access to resources and information that allow me to perform at levels that seem impossible to people who operate within conventional frameworks. What kind of resources? The kind that allow me to know about patrol routes that aren't on the official exercise schedule, Agent 7 said quietly. The kind that tell me which buildings have been constructed using specific architectural principles that create predictable sightlines. The kind that provide detailed intelligence about the backgrounds, capabilities, and psychological profiles of everyone participating in these exercises. Jake felt his breath catch. You've been evaluating us individually? Not evaluating, Agent 7 corrected. Protecting. The intelligence I have access to includes threat assessments and potential vulnerability analyses for every person in this facility. My job is to identify weaknesses that could be exploited by hostile actors and recommend countermeasures. And what have you found? Agent 7 was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much she could safely reveal. I found that this facility and the people in it are more vulnerable than anyone realizes. Your security protocols are designed to defend against external threats, but they're completely inadequate against internal ones. Internal threats? Someone like me, Agent 7 said simply. Think about it, Commander. I've been here for less than 48 hours, and in that time, I've had access to classified exercise plans, detailed facility layouts, personnel files, and the opportunity to observe and interact with some of NATO's most elite special operations personnel. If I had hostile intentions, I could have gathered enough intelligence to compromise operations across multiple countries. Jake sank back into his chair, the full implications of what Agent 7 was saying beginning to dawn on him. You're saying that our entire security framework is fundamentally flawed. I'm saying that it's based on assumptions that are no longer valid, Agent 7 replied. Modern threats don't come from uniformed soldiers crossing clearly marked boundaries. They come from people who look like they belong, who have the right credentials, who speak the right languages, and who understand how to exploit the trust that military units place in their own personnel. So what do you recommend? Agent 7 leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. That's where things get complicated, Commander. Because the countermeasures required to defend against these threats would fundamentally change how military units operate. They would require levels of internal security and verification that could seriously impact unit cohesion and operational effectiveness. Jake rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. This is a lot to process. I know. And there's more. More. Agent 7 nodded. What I've shown you so far, my tactical capabilities, my intelligence access, my ability to operate effectively within your unit structure, that's just the beginning. There are individuals out there with far more advanced capabilities than mine, and some of them don't work for the good guys. How do you know? Because I've encountered them, Agent 7 said quietly. And because stopping them is what I do for a living. Jake looked at her with new eyes, seeing not just a mysterious training participant, but Someone who operated in a world that was far more complex and dangerous than anything he had previously imagined. What exactly do you do for a living? I hunt people who hunt people like you, Agent 7 replied. I identify and neutralize threats to military installations and personnel before they can cause damage. Sometimes that means gathering intelligence, sometimes it means direct intervention, and sometimes it means working with local commanders to improve their defensive capabilities. And that's why you're here. That's part of why I'm here, Agent 7 said. But there's another reason, one that's more immediate and more personal, which is Agent 7 was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding whether to trust him with whatever she was about to reveal. Finally, she spoke. There's intelligence suggesting that someone at this facility is not who they appear to be. Someone who may be here for the same reasons I am, but with very different intentions. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. You're saying there's a hostile operative among my people? I'm saying it's possible, Agent 7 replied. And if there is, they're very good at what they do. Good enough that they've managed to remain undetected while gaining access to one of NATO's most secure training facilities. Do you have any idea who it might be? Agent 7 shook her head. Not yet, but I'm working on it. And that's why I need your help, Commander. Because if there's a hostile operative here, they're going to reveal themselves eventually. And when they do, I need to be ready for them. Jake stared at her, his mind reeling from everything she had told him. The mysterious Agent 7 had turned out to be far more complex and dangerous than he could have imagined. And now she was asking him to help her hunt for a potential enemy agent among his own people. What do you need from me? He asked finally. Agent 7 smiled, and Jake caught a glimpse of the predator he had sensed in her from the beginning. Access, she said, and trust, because what happens next is going to determine whether this facility remains secure or becomes the site of a very significant intelligence breach. Over the next 48 hours, Jake found himself living in a completely different world than the one he had known just days before. Agent 7 had opened his eyes to layers of complexity and danger that existed far beyond the straightforward military operations he was accustomed to commanding. She had asked for access and trust, and Jake had given her both, though not without reservations. The idea that there might be a hostile operative among his carefully selected personnel was almost too disturbing to accept, but Agent 7's credentials, which she had finally shared with him through encrypted channels, left no room for doubt about her authority or expertise. The woman he had known as Agent 7 was actually Major Sarah Matthews, though even that name was likely operational rather than real. Her file, what little of it he was cleared to see, indicated extensive experience with counterintelligence operations across multiple theaters. More importantly, it showed a track record of successfully identifying and neutralizing deep cover operatives who had infiltrated military and government installations. The key, Sarah explained as they reviewed personnel files in Jake's office, is to look for patterns that don't quite fit. People with perfect backgrounds that are just a little too perfect. Individuals whose skills exceed what their official training should have provided. Personnel who seem to know things they shouldn't know. Jake looked up from a file he was reviewing. You mean like you did? Sarah smiled grimly. Exactly like I did. The difference is that I was supposed to stand out just enough to draw attention to myself. A hostile operative would be doing everything possible to blend in completely. They'd been working through the files for hours, and Jake was beginning to appreciate the complexity of what Sarah did for a living. Every piece of information about each participant had to be analyzed not just for what it revealed, but for what it might be hiding. What about him? Jake asked, pointing to the file of Captain Henrik Larsson from the Danish Special Forces. His background shows extensive counterterrorism experience, but the details are somewhat vague. Sarah studied the file carefully. Possibly. The problem with Danish Special Operations records is that they maintain very high security classifications, so vague details could be legitimate. But his language capabilities are interesting, fluent in Russian and Arabic, with conversational skill in Mandarin. That's an unusual combination for someone who supposedly spent most of his career in European operations. Should we bring him in for questioning? Not yet, Sarah said. If he is our target, direct questioning will just put him on guard. We need to create situations where the truth reveals itself naturally. What kind of situations? Sarah closed the file and leaned back in her chair. The kind where people have to make choices that reveal their true loyalties and capabilities. Tomorrow's exercise is perfect for that. Jake consulted his schedule. The urban warfare simulation? Exactly. It's designed to put maximum stress on participants while requiring them to make split-second tactical decisions. Under that kind of pressure, people tend to fall back on their deepest training patterns. If someone has been trained by a foreign intelligence service, it will show in their tactical choices. And if our hypothetical operative realizes what you're doing, Sarah's expression became more serious. Then, things get complicated very quickly, because someone with the skills to infiltrate this facility and maintain their cover for any length of time won't hesitate to take direct action if they feel cornered. That evening, Jake found himself looking at his own personnel with new eyes. People he had worked with for years suddenly seemed potentially suspicious. The casual conversations in the mess hall took on new significance when viewed through the lens of someone potentially gathering intelligence. Even routine training exercises began to feel like opportunities for espionage. It was during dinner that Jake first noticed the subtle changes in the facility's atmosphere that Sarah's presence had created. There was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before, a sense that everyone was being watched and evaluated. Some of the participants seemed to be going out of their way to demonstrate their competence and loyalty, while others appeared to be withdrawing into themselves. "She's good," Lieutenant Chun observed quietly as he joined Jake at his table. "Agent 7, I mean. Whatever she's really here for, she's got everyone on edge without them even knowing why." "What makes you say that?" Jake asked, though he had noticed the same thing. "Watch the room," Chin suggested. "See how people are sitting differently, talking differently? It's like everyone suddenly feels like they're being tested, even though nothing has officially changed about the training protocols." Jake scanned the mess hall and realized that Chun was absolutely right. The easy camaraderie that had characterized the first day of exercises had been replaced by something more guarded and competitive. People were still interacting normally, but there was a subtle defensiveness in their body language that suggested they all felt like they were under scrutiny. "Do you think she's intelligence?" Chun asked directly. "I think," Jake said carefully, "that Agent 7 is exactly what this training exercise needed. Someone who could push everyone to perform at their absolute best." It was a diplomatic non-answer, but Chun seemed to accept it. Jake had learned in his years of command that sometimes the most important conversations were the ones you didn't have. Later that evening, Jake met with Sarah in the secure conference room they had been using for their investigation. She had spent the day conducting what she called behavioral reconnaissance, observing the participants during routine activities and looking for indicators that might reveal hidden agendas. "Anything interesting?" Jake asked as he reviewed her notes. "Several things," Sarah replied. "Captain Larson has been asking very specific questions about facility security protocols. Not enough to be obviously suspicious, but more detail than necessary for someone who's just here for training exercises." "What kind of questions?" "Guard rotation schedules, access procedures for sensitive areas, communication security protocols. All presented as professional curiosity, but someone with his supposed background should already know most of that information." Jake made notes on his pad. "Anyone else?" "Lieutenant Commander Reeves from the British SAS team has been conducting unauthorized reconnaissance of the administrative areas. I observed him using tradecraft techniques to avoid security cameras while mapping building layouts that aren't included in the exercise areas." "Could be professional habit," Jake suggested. "Special operations personnel are trained to gather intelligence about their operational environment." "True," Sarah agreed. But he was specifically focusing on areas that house classified materials and communication equipment. That goes beyond general situational awareness. Jake was beginning to understand why Sarah's work required such careful analysis. Almost everything that could indicate hostile activity could also have innocent explanations. The key was identifying patterns that collectively pointed in a specific direction. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "I've been monitoring communication patterns, and someone in the facility has been transmitting encrypted data packets during specific time windows when our monitoring equipment undergoes routine maintenance cycles." "You can detect that?" Sarah nodded. "I have access to specialized monitoring equipment that most facilities don't possess. The transmissions are very sophisticated. They're using frequency hopping techniques and encryption protocols that suggest state-level resources." Jake felt a chill. "So we definitely have a problem." "We have something," Sarah agreed. "Whether it's an intelligence-gathering operation, preparation for a future attack, or something else entirely, I can't say yet. But someone is definitely operating covertly within this facility." "What's our next move?" "Tomorrow's exercise," Sarah said. I've made some modifications to the scenario that will force our suspects to reveal more about their true capabilities and intentions. What kind of modifications? Sarah spread a detailed map across the table. The urban warfare simulation includes a section where teams have to respond to simulated intelligence that suggests enemy forces are planning to attack critical infrastructure. The responses to that intelligence will tell us a lot about how people really think about threat assessment and operational priorities. Jake studied the map. You're going to see who reacts like they're protecting something versus who reacts like they're gathering information about it. Exactly. Someone who's here legitimately will focus on defensive measures and threat mitigation. Someone who's here for intelligence gathering will focus on understanding the vulnerability assessment process and the specific countermeasures being implemented. And if our operative realizes what you're doing, Sarah's expression became grim. Then we find out just how dangerous they really are. The next morning brought cloudy skies and an atmosphere of tension that seemed to permeate the entire facility. Jake had spent a restless night thinking about the implications of what Sarah had told him, and he found himself analyzing every interaction with his personnel for signs of deception or hidden agendas. The urban warfare simulation was scheduled to begin at 1,000 hours, and Jake positioned himself in the main observation center where he could monitor all team communications and watch the exercise unfold through the extensive camera network. Sarah had declined to participate in this exercise, claiming she wanted to observe the other participants without the distraction of her own performance affecting their behavior. As the teams moved into position, Jake noticed that the atmosphere among the participants was different from previous exercises. There was an undercurrent of competition that seemed more intense than normal, as if everyone was aware that this simulation carried implications beyond simple training evaluation. Team assignments have been reorganized for this exercise, and Jake noted that both Captain Larson and Lieutenant Commander Reeves had been placed in leadership positions where their tactical decision-making would be clearly visible to the observers. "Control, this is Team Alpha," came Larson's voice over the radio. "We're in position and ready to begin the scenario." "Team Bravo ready," reported Reeves from his position across the simulated urban environment. Jake watched as the exercise began, noting how each team leader approached the complex tactical challenges that had been built into the scenario. The simulation involved multiple objectives: hostage rescue, infrastructure protection, and intelligence gathering, all occurring simultaneously across a sprawling urban environment. What immediately caught Jake's attention was the difference in how Larson and Reeves approached their tactical priorities. Larson's team focused heavily on the infrastructure protection mission, but his interests seemed to center more on understanding the vulnerabilities than on developing effective countermeasures. Reeves, on the other hand, was conducting his operations with a level of sophistication that seemed to exceed what his official training background would suggest. "Interesting," Sarah said quietly as she joined Jake in the observation center. "What do you see?" "Larson is mapping vulnerabilities," Sarah observed. "Look at his team's movement patterns. They're not positioning themselves to defend critical systems. They're conducting detailed reconnaissance of every access point and security measure." Jake studied the camera feeds more carefully and realized she was right. Larson's team was methodically documenting security protocols in a way that went far beyond what the exercise required. And Reeves, he's using techniques that aren't taught in any NATO special operations program, Sarah said. "Those movement patterns and communication protocols are from Russian Special Forces doctrine." Before Jake could respond, the exercise took an unexpected turn. A simulated equipment failure created a genuine emergency situation when one of the teams lost communication with the control center and became isolated in a section of the training area where a real electrical fire had started. "All teams, this is Control," Jake announced over the radio. "We have a real emergency situation in Building 7. Team Charlie is cut off, and we need immediate assistance." What happened next confirmed every suspicion that Sarah had raised. While the legitimate military personnel immediately shifted their focus to the rescue operation, both Larson and Reeves seemed more interested in exploiting the confusion to access areas that had previously been off-limits. "There," Sarah said, pointing at one of the monitors. "Larson just used the emergency as cover to enter the communications facility. He's not responding to the rescue call-out." Jake grabbed his radio. "Captain Larson, respond to emergency in Building 7 immediately." There was a long pause before Larson's voice crackled through the speaker. "Copy, Control." en route to Building 7. But the camera feeds showed that Larson was still inside the communications facility, while his radio transmission was coming from a different location entirely. He's using a remote relay, Sarah said grimly. Professional-level deception techniques. Jake felt adrenaline surge through his system as he realized they were no longer dealing with hypothetical threats. What do we do? Sarah was already moving toward the door. We stop him before he finishes whatever he came here to do. As alarms began sounding throughout the facility, partly from the real fire emergency and partly from Sarah's activation of security protocols Jake hadn't even known existed, he realized that the next few minutes would determine whether this NATO facility remained secure or became the site of a significant intelligence breach. The hunt was no longer theoretical. It had become a race against time, with national security hanging in the balance. The next few minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance between predator and prey, except Jake wasn't entirely sure who was which. Sarah moved through the facility with a fluid efficiency that made her previous demonstrations of tactical skill seem almost casual by comparison. She was no longer maintaining her cover as a training participant. She had become something far more dangerous and focused. Building 7 first, Sarah said as they rushed through the corridors. We need to secure the genuine emergency before we can deal with the intelligence breach. Jake followed her, noting how she navigated the facility with perfect knowledge of layouts that weren't included in any briefing materials she should have had access to. It was another reminder that Agent 7, Major Sarah Matthews, operated in a world where normal security classifications were merely suggestions. They arrived at Building 7 to find organized chaos. The electrical fire had been contained, but Team Charlie was still trapped on the upper floors due to smoke in the stairwells. Jake immediately began coordinating the rescue operation, but he noticed that Sarah was dividing her attention between the emergency response and something else entirely. What are you monitoring? Jake asked during a brief lull in radio communications. Electronic signatures, Sarah replied, holding what appeared to be a specialized scanning device. If Larson is transmitting intelligence data, he'll be doing it now, while security attention is focused elsewhere. As if summoned by her words, Jake's radio crackled with an emergency transmission. Control, this is Lieutenant Phillips. We have an unauthorized individual in the Secure Communications Center, requesting immediate backup. Jake felt his blood turn cold. Phillips was one of his most trusted communication specialists, and the Secure Center housed some of the facility's most sensitive equipment. That's our confirmation, Sarah said grimly. Larson took the bait. He used the emergency as cover to access the real target. They ran through the corridors toward the communications center, Jake's mind racing through the implications. If Larson had managed to access the secure systems, the intelligence breach could compromise operations across multiple countries and put lives at risk around the world. When they reached the communications center, they found Lieutenant Phillips standing guard outside the main entrance, his sidearm drawn, but not yet aimed. Sir, Phillips reported, the individual entered using valid access codes, but his behavior is highly suspicious. He's been attempting to access systems that are way above his clearance level. Where is he now? Sarah asked. Still inside. He doesn't know I'm monitoring him from the secondary station. Sarah checked her equipment again, then looked at Jake with an expression he couldn't quite read. Commander, I need you to understand something before we go in there. What happens next might not be what you expect. What do you mean? I mean that this operation has been more complex from the beginning than I initially told you. Larson's presence here isn't coincidental, and neither is mine. Jake stared at her, a terrible suspicion beginning to form in his mind. Are you saying this was a setup? I'm saying that sometimes the best way to catch a spy is to give them exactly what they think they're looking for, Sarah replied. But I need you to trust me for just a few more minutes. Before Jake could respond, Sarah was moving toward the communications center entrance. She gestured for Phillips to step aside and approach the door with her weapon drawn, but held low. Captain Larson, she called out in a voice that carried clear authority. This is Major Matthews. You need to step away from the console and surrender immediately. There was silence from inside the room, then the sound of rapid keystrokes, as if someone was frantically trying to complete a download or transmission. Larson, Sarah called again, you have 30 seconds before I come in there. And I should mention that the systems you're attempting to access are honeypots. Every keystroke you've made has been monitored and recorded. The keystrokes stopped abruptly. What's a honeypot? Jake asked quietly. Fake systems designed to attract and trap intelligence operatives, Sarah explained without taking her eyes off the door. Everything he thinks he's stolen is actually disinformation we wanted him to have. A moment later, the door to the communications center opened, and Captain Henrik Larson emerged with his hands raised. But instead of the defeated expression Jake expected to see, Larson was smiling. Brilliant, Larson said in accented English that Jake now realized wasn't quite Danish. Absolutely brilliant. I wondered when you would reveal yourself, Major. Sarah kept her weapon trained on him, but didn't seem surprised by his response. Colonel Petrov, I presume? Or are you still maintaining the Danish cover? Jake felt the world shift around him as he realized that both Sarah and the man he had known as Captain Larson were operating at levels far beyond anything he had imagined. The Danish identity has served its purpose, Larson replied. Though I must say, infiltrating this facility was easier than my briefings suggested it would be. NATO security protocols have some significant vulnerabilities, which was exactly what we wanted you to discover, Sarah said. Every vulnerability you found was deliberately placed. Every security gap you exploited was carefully designed to guide you toward the systems we wanted you to access. Jake found his voice. Someone want to explain what the hell is going on here? Sarah glanced at him briefly. Commander, meet Colonel Viktor Petrov, formerly of Russian military intelligence, currently freelancing for various interested parties. He's been on our watch list for 3 years. And Major Matthews, Petrov said with what seemed like genuine respect, is one of the few operatives capable of successfully running a counterintelligence operation of this complexity. I should have realized sooner that my invitation to this training exercise was too convenient to be coincidental. Your invitation? Jake asked, struggling to keep up with the rapid revelations. Oh yes, Petrov replied. I was specifically recruited for this exercise by what I believed were Danish intelligence contacts. The opportunity to infiltrate a NATO facility and assess their security capabilities was too valuable to pass up. Sarah lowered her weapon slightly. What Victor doesn't know yet is that his Danish contacts have been working for us for the past 18 months. This entire operation was designed to draw him out and document his methods. But more than that, Sarah continued, we needed to identify his network. Victor is talented, but he's not working alone. Someone has been providing him with intelligence about NATO operations, and we needed to find out who. Jake's mind reeled as he tried to process the layers of deception and counterintelligence that had been unfolding around him without his knowledge. Are you telling me that this entire training exercise was a setup? Not the entire exercise, Sarah said. The legitimate participants are here for genuine training purposes. But Victor's presence gave us an opportunity to run a controlled operation that would force his handlers to reveal themselves. Petrov laughed, though there wasn't much humor in the sound. And did you succeed in identifying my network, Major? We identified enough, Sarah replied, including the fact that your communications with your handlers have been compromised for several months. Every piece of intelligence you've provided them has been carefully controlled information designed to mislead them about NATO capabilities. Impossible, Petrov said, but Jake could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. Is it? Sarah asked. Think about your last 3 operations, Victor. How many of them achieved their stated objectives? How many times did you find exactly what you expected to find, with just enough resistance to make it feel authentic? Jake watched as understanding dawned on Petrov's face, followed quickly by something that looked like respect mixed with resignation. You've been running me for months, Petrov said quietly. We've been running your entire network for months, Sarah corrected. You were just the final piece we needed to close the loop. Jake stepped forward, his command authority finally reasserting itself over his confusion. Major Matthews, I think you owe me a complete explanation of what's been happening at my facility. Sarah nodded, finally holstering her weapon. Of course, Commander. But first, I need to implement the final phase of this operation. She pulled out a radio and spoke into it using codes Jake had never heard before. Control, this is Nightingale. Package is secured. Initiate Phoenix protocol. Within minutes, the facility was swarming with personnel Jake didn't recognize. Intelligence operatives, technical specialists, and security teams that moved with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of extensive planning and preparation. Commander Morrison, said a woman in civilian clothes who approached them with clear authority. I'm Director Rebecca Hayes, Defense Intelligence Agency. I apologize for the deception. but this operation required absolute compartmentalization to be successful. Jake looked around at the controlled chaos surrounding them. Just how long has this been planned? 6 months, Director Hayes replied. We've been tracking Colonel Petrov's network for over 2 years, but we needed a way to identify all the players and document their methods without alerting them to our surveillance. So you used my facility as bait. We use your facility as a controlled environment where we could observe and document enemy intelligence operations without compromising genuine national security interests, Hayes corrected. Every piece of classified information that Colonel Petrov accessed was either outdated or deliberately misleading. Sarah stepped closer to Jake. Commander, I know this is a lot to process, but you need to understand that what we've accomplished here will significantly improve security at NATO installations worldwide. Victor's methods, his network's communication protocols, their intelligence priorities, all of that information will be used to develop better countermeasures. Jake looked at Petrov, who was now surrounded by security personnel, but seemed almost relaxed, as if he was genuinely impressed by the complexity of the operation that had ensnared him. What happens to him now? Jake asked. That depends on Colonel Petrov, Director Hayes replied. He has some choices to make about his future cooperation with our efforts to roll up the rest of his network. Petrov smiled wryly. I suppose I should have realized that any operation this elegant was too sophisticated to be a simple security lapse. Major Matthews, you have my professional admiration. Sarah nodded. And you have mine, Colonel. Your infiltration techniques are among the best I've encountered. Under different circumstances, we might have been colleagues rather than adversaries. Perhaps, Petrov replied, though I suspect your definition of different circumstances and mine would vary considerably. As the intelligence teams began processing evidence and securing the facility, Jake found himself reflecting on everything that had transpired. The woman he had known as Agent 7 had turned out to be running one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operations he had ever encountered, using his facility and his people as unwitting participants in a complex game of deception and misdirection. Major Matthews, Jake said as the immediate crisis began to wind down, I have one more question. Of course, Commander. When you first arrived here, when my people were speculating about who you were and why you were here, did you know then how this would all play out? Sarah considered the question carefully. I knew that we would successfully identify and capture Colonel Petrov. I knew that his network would be compromised and that NATO security would be significantly improved as a result. She paused, looking at Jake with an expression that seemed more human than anything he had seen from her during their time together. What I didn't know was whether you would be able to adapt to the reality of how modern intelligence operations actually work. Whether you could handle learning that the world of military security is far more complex and dangerous than most commanders realize. And Sarah smiled, and for the first time since he had met her, it seemed completely genuine. You've exceeded my expectations, Commander. The way you adapted to new information, the way you supported the operation even when you didn't fully understand it, that's exactly the kind of leadership that makes operations like this possible. Jake looked around at the controlled chaos of the intelligence operation that was still unfolding around them. So what happens now? Now, Director Hayes said, joining their conversation, you receive a commendation for your cooperation with a classified operation that significantly advanced national security interests. Your facility receives some substantial security upgrades, and you probably never see Major Matthews again, unless something similar happens in the future. Jake nodded, understanding that this was how operations at this level concluded, with results rather than explanations, with improved security rather than public recognition. As the day wore on and the intelligence teams completed their work, Jake found himself standing alone with Sarah in the same conference room where she had first revealed the true nature of her mission. Any regrets? Jake asked. Sarah shook her head. This is what I do, Commander. I identify threats and neutralize them before they can cause damage. Today we prevented what could have been a significant intelligence breach while simultaneously compromising a hostile network that has been operating against NATO interests for years. And the people who were mocked when you first arrived, the ones who said, "Who is she?" like you didn't belong here, Sarah laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. They weren't wrong to be suspicious. I didn't belong here, at least not in the way they understood belonging. But sometimes being an outsider is exactly what a situation requires. Jake extended his hand. Major Matthews, it's been an honor serving with you. even if I didn't understand what we were really doing most of the time. Sarah shook his hand, her grip firm and professional. Commander Morrison, if you ever find yourself dealing with situations that seem too complex for conventional military responses, remember that there are people like me out there. People who specialize in the spaces between the normal rules. As she turned to leave, Jake called after her. Major, Sarah, what's the command code? The one that made me freeze when you first used it. Sarah paused at the door, looking back with a mysterious smile. That wasn't a command code, Commander. That was just me asking if you were ready to see how deep the rabbit hole really goes. And was I? You're still standing, Sarah replied. I'd say that answers the question. After she left, Jake remained in the conference room for a long time, thinking about everything that had transpired. The woman who had arrived as Agent 7, who had been mocked and questioned by his people, had turned out to be one of the most capable and dangerous operatives he had ever encountered. More than that, she had opened his eyes to a world of threats and countermeasures that existed far beyond anything covered in conventional military training. The next time someone arrived at his facility with mysterious credentials and exceptional capabilities, Jake would know to look deeper before making assumptions about who they were and why they were there. In the intelligence business, he had learned nothing was ever quite what it seemed, and that was exactly what made it so effective.